So to replace a motor on a Solar Breeze NX, the first thing you have to do is to remove the pontoon. The pontoon, of course, is the gray part on the bottom. Flip the unit over, you remove the chlorine tray, and also remove the debris tray. And you'll notice that there are 5 screws embedded on each side of the pontoon, and then there are 5 screws on tabs on each side on the inside of the pontoon. Once again, a number 10 Torx screwdriver bit. I use an extension with an electric drill. It's probably the easiest way to do it. You can, if you have a long enough screwdriver, do it by hand if you like. Make sure your screwdriver bit is secured on the head of the screw, and then you just go and loosen all of the screws in the embedded screw bosses inside the pontoon like this. And then you remove the screws on the tabs on the inside of the pontoon also. Just set those aside. So I don't actually remove the screws here. I leave them in place, which also makes it easier for replacing the pontoon. So let's get these out. Sometimes you have to fool around a little bit to make sure the bit is lodged in the screw head. So there you go. So now all of the screws, the inside ones are removed. The outside ones here, or the ones embedded in the pontoons, are loosened. And you should be able to just lift it up like that. I don't take these screws out. I like to leave them in. It makes the reassembly easier. So for now, we'll just set this pontoon aside. So you've removed the pontoon, and we're going to replace the rear motor. So the rear motor, of course, is located at the rear on this rear motor platform assembly. And there's 4 screws that hold this platform assembly in place. So the first thing is to remove those 4 screws. Set them aside. Now, that should simply lift up. You want to slide the paddle wheel hub off of the paddle wheel. And then you'll need to cut this zip tie so that you can get at the motor connection. And now you see this nut screws onto the motor connector, so you simply unscrew that nut. You may need a pair of pliers, perhaps, or 2 pairs. You might want to hold this at the same time that you're turning it, depending on how tight it is. And then you simply slide this off. So the motor connector slides off of, or the wire harness connector slides off of the motor connector. There's 4 screws that hold the motor in place on the platform assembly. And there you replace the motor. So you notice that the rear motor has a larger gear on it. Let's pretend now that this is the replacement motor you've received. And you would simply go in reverse. You'll notice that there's an arrow on the motor connector. And if you look underneath the nut here on the wire harness connector, there's also an arrow on it. And you want to line up those 2 arrows. Also, they're lined up with the arrow is also a marking on this part of the connector here. So they all kind of line up together. Just gently push it in, make sure that you want to make sure that these pins on the wire harness connector are lined up with the receptors on the motor connector there. So once again, just line it up, push it together, and then tighten up the nut. Once again, if your fingers aren't as strong as mine, you might need a pair of pliers just to make sure everything is tight. So now you've got the motor connected back to the wire harness assembly. And then you will take the motor and you simply replace those 4 screws that I just took out. So now the gear assembly or platform assembly is reconnected to the motor. You'll want to, first of all, before you install this, you want to make sure that the axle that goes through this rear wheel is put right over top of that screw boss for this axle, because your rear screw is going to go through there. So you want to make sure those are lined up. Then you put the paddle wheel hub back onto the paddle wheel, and you line up the screw holes with the screw bosses. And you'll notice that the screws that hold these rear platform assemblies in place don't have a flange. So you want to make sure you're using the unflanged screws when you're putting these. You'll notice these ones here have a flange. These are not the ones you want for these rear platform assemblies. Take these unflanged screws and drop them into place. And tighten them up. And now that's installed back in place. Once again, just check to make sure this axle is positioned correctly over that screw boss. Reach underneath, turn it on to test, make sure everything's running fine, nothing's interfering. So the next part of it is to simply reattach the zip tie that we removed from this area here, so that all of these wire components are held in place. Just make sure that you have a zip tie that's long enough to wrap around that entire assembly there. You locate the hole in the stanchion and slide the zip tie through there, pull it around and connect it and yank it together, and then you have that whole thing being held in place. And we can just clip off the excess here. And we're ready to go. Once again, quick test, make sure that everything is running. So now you've replaced the rear motor and you're ready to reattach the pontoon. So we've complicated matters a little bit because we've changed to a new wire harness system for our motors and our motor assemblies this year for a couple of reasons. One is it's more reliable, but also we were having some issues with our previous supplier. When we're replacing motors, both front and rear, with the new wire harness assembly to units that have the old wire harness, it complicates matters a little bit. So I've asked Robert Cameron, who's our lead technician, to help me out a little bit here, and we'll just show you how to do that. Because occasionally you may get a motor where the connector doesn't match up exactly with what's on your unit. But you can still make the repair, and we'll show you how to do that. So once again, you simply remove all of the screws that hold the rear motor assembly in place, and pull that up, disconnect the paddle wheel hub from the paddle wheel, and once again, you'll need to remove the motor from the wire harness, or from the gear platform. So just remove these 4 screws here. Okay, so we've removed the motor from the rear motor platform. The next part of it is we just need to clip this twist tie to free up that whole assembly. And then, as before, simply remove, unscrew this nut that's on the wire harness from the motor assembly and pull it apart. So this is where things get a little more complicated now. You may receive a motor that looks like this, and you'll notice that it doesn't match exactly with the new assembly. And so in order to make that work, the first thing you have to do is to actually trim this off. So I'm just using a regular box cutter. Always cut away from yourself, not towards yourself, and simply remove that. How did I do, Robert? Is that close enough, or do I need to trim that a little?
That's pretty close.
Maybe trim that a little bit so we get it as close as possible.
Yeah, as long as the connectors are making point in each one of the points, we're good.
So what we just needed to free up that connector there. So now you can see that this connector here from the wire harness will now connect with this motor. You simply slide it in like this. Now, there's no thread to screw it to, so instead of using the threads to hold it in place and make it watertight, we actually use a heat shrink. And if we sent you a motor like this, we'll have also sent you this type of heat shrink. So just slide the heat shrink over top of the motor. Once again, line things up so that the pins on this motor connector, or the arrow that's here, lines up with the arrow on the motor, on the new motor. Make sure I'm lined up there. Yep, slide it together.
If it goes in, you're lined up.
Yeah, slide it together, make sure it's tight. Slide this heat shrink over top of this assembly here. About there, Robert?
About there, but before we do that, to maintain water tightness just in this area, we do want to remove the former
so we
cap.
Actually remove that.
Yes,
okay.
And with that, we can use any pair of clippers.
Okay, why don't you go ahead and do
go
that
right
for me.
in there. Snip, snip, off.
Perfect.
And it does come right off.
Excellent. Okay, that makes more sense. And so now you've got this assembly. Slide that heat shrink over there. You'll need a heat gun, or or a high output hair dryer will work as well.
We did test a high output hair dryer, and it did in fact shrink the heat shrink.
Why don't you show your technique for
some of the best ones. You don't want it to stretch, but holding it straight up and down. Rotate a little bit. Now it will get hot, so do be careful about that, but it's not going to get hot enough to...
What about this area here? Should we just heat that up a little bit more?
Yeah, but still be careful about pointing the heat gun at the plastic.
Right, okay. So there you go. And you notice the heat shrink actually has glue inside it. You can see a little bit of glue coming out the edges here. So when you heat it up, the combination of the heat shrink and the glue seals that up very well and makes it nice and watertight.
And you can tell that it is sealed if the glue does start seeping out just a little bit. Right.
And then once again, so what you can do is remove the gear from the old motor. And install it on the new motor. You'll notice that you just need to line up the shaft with the gear. You know, probably turn it on, test it. You see the motor's turning. That's all good. Put the screws back in place. And you notice we use the flanged screws for the motor assembly. If you didn't see the other video, We have a combination of flanged and unflanged screws. The unflanged screws are used for putting the gear platform back onto the top housing, but the flanged screws are used for installing the motor. So just tighten those up. You know, feel free to pass judgment on me here, Robert, if you see me doing
No,
something wrong.
you're doing good. Just off as a note, sometimes the sealant glue can cause an impediment in one of the screw bosses that we have, and that's just carved out easily.
Right.
In fact, usually drilling it will force that down and seat it more.
Sure.
But do make sure that, like you just did, that it is in contact with the motor.
Right.
You're not going to damage the motor by moving it around.
So we're just checking to make sure that this gear here is engaged with the output shaft gear for the motor. Reinstall the platform. So line up the holes with the screw bosses there. And then this is where you use the unflanged screws to reattach the rear gear platform. So there's 4 of those. Simply screw them into place like that. Once again, better if you have smaller fingers.
Or you've done over 1,000 of them.
Yes. There we go. So the next part is put this tire back in, just slide it inside, and you need to make sure that this axle goes over top of the screw boss that's there. So slide it in, you can kind of line it up, and then slide this axle in, and make sure it's over top of the screw boss so that it's anchored there. So why don't you show everyone how you attach those?
All right. This is relatively easy. First off, I just aim for that arrow right down into the driven hole around both the connector and the wire that's snaking around.
What about these ones here? Do you worry about those?
Typically, no. It's this one. This will be connected all the way down.
Right. So we don't need to worry
we
about
don't need to
getting those in
worry
the
about
zip
that
tie.
one.
We're really just worried about making sure these wires here are.
Yeah, it'll be the motor connector wires, and if it's disconnected, the solar panel
Right.
connector that will get caught in there if they're not
Right.
connected. Otherwise,
So just pull that up nice and tight.
and clip it a little short.
Perfect. There you go. So now you have a new motor on your unit. Test it out. Everything's running awesome. You're ready to install your pontoon.
Once you're done with any repair, you're going to need to put the pontoon back on. So first, I do line up the rear screws to the screw bosses. They are slightly free floating, but they will just slide right in. 1 and 2. And then I guide the front screws into their holes, making sure that I do in fact put the LED lights, which can be forgotten rather easily. They're a small part. Back in place. Seat it all down. Make sure that there's no gaps on either side. And commence to start midway. And going down and across. Kind of like building a ladder or a snake. When you get to the front screws, make sure they all do go down, and then 3 or 4 quarter turns in the opposite way just to make sure that it is free flowing. The screws will still be engaged. It's just going to make sure that these wheels are not hindered in any way, shape, or form. So same for left side. And these will go all the way in. They'll still be free flowing. And then we go with the inside. So the 6 inside screw bosses take the longer screws. The 4 on the outside take the shorter. So if you need a comparison. And then do double check that you have used all your screws. There should be 6 again on the inside of the longer 14 millimeter and 4 shorter on the outside. It's very important that you get the shorter on the outside. If you do happen to use a longer screw on any of the outside portions, you may find yourself with a small dimple on the connecting portions on the top housing. All right, easiest way for the debris tray is straight up and down. Just slide it right in. You'll see these 2 grooves on either side of the pontoon. Make sure that the handle is facing up the same direction. Just slides in, give it a nice little tug. That's all good. And the chlorine tray, same thing. The orientation is similar with the handle being on the right side. And that's how you put together your pontoon.